Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Exeter Institutogram conversation with me, Sajjad Rizvi, from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. And today we'll be in conversation with Edith Szanto, who is at the University of Alabama, and we'll be discussing her research, which she has given me the title of Islam and the in Syria and Iraq, and I'm quite looking forward to discussing what that means. So just waiting for Edith to join us. It's connecting. Hi Edith, how are you?
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for having me on here. I'm
No,
good,
no, it's
thank
good
you.
good to see you. Good to see you. It's been a while. And I see you've got a fan going in the background, so it must be nice and warm there in Alabama.
30 degrees Celsius this week.
Yeah, oh,
Although,
it's not quite nowhere near that here yet. It rarely is, as you know.
well, yeah,
Um, so welcome to this conversation, and
thank you.
I'm intrigued by the title that you've given us. I of course know you are an anthropologist of religion, and that you've worked in two contexts, in the Syrian and Iraqi context, which I guess is where the title comes from to a certain extent. So I think the best place to start is if you could, tell me what do you mean by Islam and development in these two contexts, and how are they connected, and what do you intend to do out of this project?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I think development is an interesting way of putting that. I
Yeah,
thought about other words to use. One
yeah,
could use other words like modernity or progress or education or many
right,
of these other sort of buzzwords. And each one of them has a different kind of connotation that it
right,
can, right? And I use development here because it's a little provocative
hmm,
and it's because I just taught a class this last semester on Islam in the West, and we not only went through, of course, what is Orientalism, but power dynamics and the usual,
yeah,
and it made me think about something that is an important issue here. As you know, here I'm at the University of Alabama, and I have Russell McCutcheon as my chair,
yeah,
and he really cares about the whole question of categorization and
hmm,
how we categorize things.
sure,
And that means in this case, okay, so how do we, is progress, I think, is a way of categorizing something and purposefully so, of course. And so I am looking at the work that that particular term and that particular concept can do.
hmm,
The way I got into this is a really more practical story, and it goes like this. This last year, while I was, that is now a year and a half ago, that when I was
hmm,
still in Suleimania. In Suli, I started to go to the local to attend the local churches as well. So in
right,
the past, I mainly went to all these Sufi groups, and then I started to going to these churches, and I noticed the kind of discourse that they were using. And
hmm,
many of them came not as missionaries, but as teachers, other sort of aid workers, and development certainly was a theme there.
hmm,
And so that's how I got onto this or latched onto this idea of development. Because one could just as easily call it, well, conversion to Christianity through education or through
right, yeah,
development work. Is the UN, how is that involved? Or the American University itself, right? Any and all of these things. In any case, so I thought development is an interesting way to ask about not just change, but but because it's purposeful change.
right,
What does
yeah,
that do? I
hmm,
also have to admit I was inspired later onwards after coming here being Alabama. I
hmm,
have a neighbor downstairs who's this lovely little older woman, and she worked for Aramco in the 70s. And
Okay.
with her husband, of course, and they were in Saudi Arabia for 10 years. And so I started talking to her, and she started giving me these books about well, missionaries in the Middle East. And these are all these fan fiction books of sorts.
Hmm.
And this seems to be a thing around here. So
Right.
I started reading them, and it's an interesting into thinking about religion. And even one of my students in my Religion 100, in my introduction class to religion, pulled out one of these when we were having a conversation. And
Right.
so then I started thinking about this topic, especially also given that here in Alabama also, Alabama is a huge state, right? It's the size of Germany with a population of only 5 million. So the state here is also relatively weak, and churches do the work of quote unquote development. So
Right.
this got me going in this direction and just
Yeah.
explore.
So by development there, you're talking about sort of services, societal cohesion, education, and all these kinds of other things. Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh,
Exactly. And now
um,
with everything that's happening, and this is of course not going into that project, but I find it interesting how in the beginning, there was this whole question of, are churches allowed to meet? Are they essential services? How do you
yeah.
categorize these things? And there were some churches that were accused of meeting despite, of course, the ban, and they were then seen as backward. The churches themselves, however, patted themselves on the back by saying, but we're there to not just provide essential services, we're
Mm.
feeding the hungry, those poor single women with
Yeah.
children, and we're the ones that are handing out tests. So it's
Mm.
interesting how categorization, again, to go back to Russell's favorite terms, here makes a difference. If these churches count as an extension of the state, then that would be one thing. But if we, of course, have this whole division between church and state, then it's not. Anyways, and how does that apply over there? It's a good, interesting question.
Yeah. No, but it's also, I mean, like,
Mm.
there are two kind of obvious connections which come to my mind immediately. One is, for example, the role of what are often called Islamist or post-Islamist organizations in the provision of services, right? But the
Yes.
other one, of course, is this kind of post-90s, looking at the period after 1970s, the Faisal era, of how it is that Muslim states, were part of the so-called Islamic revival, but also of, kind of like, I don't know, can you call them the green tigers or like the sort of the Islamic tigers, sort of economies, places like Malaysia, which are very much about bringing the Muslim identity together with development, with progress, with basically, the increase of wealth and GDP and all those sorts of things which come
Ab-
along with it.
Absolutely. I spoke with Samir al-Karanshawi the other day about
Okay, yeah.
this
How's he doing? I
idea.
hope he's doing well.
He's doing
It's
all
been a
right.
while. Yeah.
And to quote him, as I asked him, so what's the difference? This is after we'd already gone online with
Yeah.
online courses. So unfortunately, there was no chance to discuss this in detail with the class. I was really looking forward to it. We were reading, um, Revzadegi,
Okay
Occidental,
then. Oh, Ahmed, yeah.
and also I had them read Shariati and again in the Islam in the West class to sort of
Mm.
think about this in some more complicated ways. And and so I asked him, so what's the difference between these churches and the Muslim Brotherhood, according to him, precisely as you just pointed out, with
Yeah.
all of these organizations. He said, the difference is that in Alabama, it is probably about going back to the community and onto a communal sort
Mm.
of grass levels community cohesion of sorts, although I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily it, given that we're home to the largest mega church here that has 80,000 people
Right.
attend every Sunday. And by the way, they give you coffee Sunday morning to make sure that you're properly with it while you're attending.
Yeah.
And they have these huge screens and cinemas in any case. So, and he said that in contrast, he thought that the Muslim Brotherhood aimed to run the state like an NGO, which these
Right.
churches certainly don't. So then I thought about that's really interesting. Then it's really about the internal dynamics of these organizations that could be distinguished and analyzed. Anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I mean, I think that kind of the potential there for like a quite an interesting comparative kind of Islam Christianity project is also there. I think
Yeah.
that we build up. So, and certainly, I mean, I think this whole question of how religion works in, especially in you know, a country like the United States, has clear kind of links with how you might look at it in other places. Because, you know, you're talking about a state which is in many ways seems deeply religious, and one in which I guess religion and development are very much go hand in hand. So absolutely.
Have you, now that we're at the end, of course, of our quarantine spring semester, or as there have been many names for 2020 already, but one of the things I just finished watching was a Netflix series that came out last summer called The Family. And it is about Christians and Christian conservatives, or a particular group called the Family, taking over Washington, D.C. And I
Oh,
thought about these as being great examples for my introduction to religion class,
hmm.
since our book, and Russell McCutcheon in particular, likes to pay attention to legal court cases. I just thought that was fascinating. And all sorts of interesting cases, of course, as you said. One can draw all sorts of interesting comparisons with that. Perhaps that's a bit more far-fetched, but nevertheless, the ideas.
Yeah, no, I mean I've heard of it. I haven't seen it. I have seen some episodes of another series on Sky, which is about a you know, evangelicals and basically running a business, right? So with a mega church, which is very much a business, and you know, various members of the family have doubts about their faith. The others are up to no good, and there's a lot of money laundering, it seems, going on as well. Um, but there's also this kind of charismatic element of what religion is, which is about embracing wealth, very much embracing wealth, you know, putting on lavish barbecues and so forth. And I suspect certainly, you know, you'd find similar kinds of things. I mean, you know, uh, lavish spending. For example, we're in Ramadan now, you know, in a lot of Muslim countries, you know, organizations, religious organizations often put on these very lavish kind of iftars and provide other services. And it's not just about feeding, it's not just about the message, but it's also, it's kind of flexing muscle, and it's showing that they have power and prestige and wealth as well.
Oh, absolutely, you're right. And whether or not this is Egypt or Iraq or anywhere else, absolutely. It is so showing that one has the community and that the community holds together. I was thinking also in well, of various mosques that one in Suli, where I was told not to go, but there are a couple of mosques that had these really interesting little businesses around them, right? That were all tied in, and we know that this is the case, and this is the case, interestingly, differently in
Yeah,
different places. So, for instance, well, you know these things better than anybody else, so where you will get certain discounts if you build a mosque on business premises, etc.
yeah. And then of course, I mean, this is even happening here, where you know, mosques do have like ground floor space for shops, right? So
Hmm.
it's and there's always this thing about how Islam's always been a commercial, mercantile religion. So the relationship with, you know, between like prayer and, I guess, you know, financial transactions has always been there. Um,
Everywhere, I
but
would have,
yeah,
even
but
if
I
it,
think that that's always the case. I mean, you know, if religion is about transactions, there's always going to be a financial element coming into
oh,
it.
of course. Oh, of
Um,
course. And even if it is gifting, right now I'm finishing up this piece on gifting, and which I wrote ages ago, and revising it. And thinking about how much gifting is part, of course, it's also part of finance. Of course, in order to
yeah,
be able to gift, in order to be able to donate and volunteer, you still have to have money. That is still a necessary part of it. Of course, it always is, right? And
yeah,
then this question is like, who funds things, and where does it all go?
yeah,
And who makes what possible? And yeah, who are these? whether or not this is missionaries or food or whatever else it is, who can go, when, where, and
Yeah.
yeah, fascinating,
So,
fascinating.
I mean, maybe you can tell us a bit more about these, I guess, these kind of case studies of Syria and Iraq. I mean, what sorts of things are you looking at it, and what do you mean by Syria and Iraq here?
I really just mean, well, the data that I have looked at. So really, all of the things so far, I have done a number of different kinds of case studies. I've looked at these various. I've looked at in the past. I've looked at churches. I've looked at Sufis. I've looked at shrines, and that's what I mean, of course, I will continue to do so. Although, of course, now that I no longer have the kind of access that I did in the past, and of
Mm.
course, I knew that that this is going to be a different part of my life now that I'm
Mm.
here, and this yeah, a different stage of my career, shall we say. I'm
Yeah.
now looking at these questions, or at these case studies in a little bit from a couple of steps further back.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to them, of course. So I'm still going to write about, in this case, um, these uh, these religious organizations and what that means in terms of
Mm.
development. And I'll look at probably a church, a Sufi order, and at the Husseiniya.
Right.
That'll be in one place. Of course, I'm still finishing up my project on Syria.
Mm.
That book is finally now going to come out now that I'm at a place where it'll count towards tenure. And
It's,
and also I'm doing these larger questions. Among other things, one of the things that I'll be doing now is well, I'm editing a small little book. Well, a book now called Islam in 5 Minutes, which is for a series edited by Russell McCutcheon,
right.
and so that's going to be looking critically at sort of these smaller issues and
Mm.
how we look at them. And then the
Yeah.
next one is going to be something larger, and I'm not quite sure yet, I have to admit yet, where this is going to take me.
Mm.
One thing that's for certain is that you know, with everything that's going on, in certain ways, it seems almost like we have to all move. I mean, we've either all become, of course, historians, and it's important to do historical work, of course. Um, but I'm just interested to see how this is going to now develop, and I want to somehow make it relevant. I'm not quite sure yet how that's going to happen, but it will.
Well, I mean, the whole kind of age of COVID may well change the way we look at some of these categories. I mean, I think some religious leaders and organizations are kind of being found out, um, and um, and yes, maybe some of the uh, priorities that we place in terms of, you know, what do we want to achieve and what do we want our wider community and societies to achieve, they may have to be revised as well. I mean, you know, suddenly people are talking about how the air is so much cleaner than it was before, and you know, there are animals roaming around kind of urban streets and stuff like that. So, uh, of course, there's a certain kind of bucolic kind of nostalgia involved in that sort of stuff as well. But certainly, it's quite possible that we might have to be rethinking all sorts of relationships, and I mean, certainly with some religious organizations, I think it's been a bit easier. Others not so much so. Um, but so I mean, maybe you can say a bit more about you know, one of these case studies, and then we'll come back to the kind of big questions that you're trying to use them to address.
Let me, sounds good. So the paper that it's actually something that you and we talked about way back when in 2013 is when I went to when I walked the Ashura what am I saying, the Arba'in walk,
Yeah.
and so this is that paper.
Right.
That paper is now rewritten for the third time about, and so
Hmm.
now I'm asking myself, or one of the questions that I'm thinking about is to rethink this instead and ask the question of what is a pilgrimage?
Yeah.
Uh, because a pilgrimage doesn't have to be, I mean, do you have to do the walk in order to be walking? No, theoretically
Yeah.
you don't, right? I mean, you could
You can
do
take the
other
bus.
things. Yes, you can take a bus, you can keep walking and go back at night and sleep at home or so, right? Take a, I mean, there's all sorts of combinations that you can do. So is it a
Yeah.
walk? Not necessarily, right? Like, is it about, do you necessarily have to go into the shrine? The year that I went, they closed it down because of something, you know, because of some bomb threat. But was it still a visitation? Yes, even though you couldn't go inside. Was it about a sacred space in a context where there's just so much trash around, right?
Yeah.
Like, how does are those two things mutually exclusive? I don't think so. But it's something to point out. Then the next one, of course, is always one of the things that most articles point out is the whole feeling of community. And is this community, is this ever divided community? Of course, it's a divided community at the same time. So we have all of these various assumptions that we assume are there or are necessary parts of a pilgrimage,
Yeah.
and yet none of them are actually completely necessary. So if we think about this as perhaps as a family resemblance kind of definition,
Mm.
that a pilgrimage must have most of these things, and yet we don't. So what does that mean? In any case, so this would be an example of precisely the kind of exercise, at least I think at the moment, going into this, that would allow me to question the category
Yeah. And
as
then
a
I think that's very useful. I mean, I've actually got on my desk this, this new collection on pilgrimages, edited by Babak Rahimi and Peyman Ishqi, yes.
Mhm.
And it is interesting precisely because it, deliberately goes beyond the Hajj, um, for which you could say, well, in theory, there are certain things which you have to do in Hajj. But certainly with a ziyarah, with a pilgrimage generally, it's much more loose. And I guess it's the same with Hajj. People do it for different reasons. We have enough kind of autobiographical material, even about Hajj, which suggests that there's a lot more going on than some sort of act of piety. And you can see this in the big pilgrimages. I mean, I've done Arbaeen a few times as well, and you can see that. I mean, there's so much food. It's about who you're hanging out with, who you're meeting people with. For some people, it's about meeting family who live in different countries, because
Absolutely.
you spend
Why
most of
not?
the day. Or friends, you meet them every year here who live in other parts of the world. So I think there's a lot of other things clearly going on. And then there's the different kind of communities which are together. And of course, if you've got so many people, then, the vast majority of them are not going to be inside the shrine at any time. It's just not
Absolutely.
possible.
And now
If
the question,
Yeah,
absolutely. You're right. Now, of course, this does not in any whatsoever sense undermine any of that. It doesn't.
no,
And then the question then is, what do we do with that? Do we simply, is the goal a very thick description where we then simply look at all of these various issues? Is it, what is the goal that we ask with these various studies? So
mm,
far, right, there are a couple of studies that have come out in the last couple of years on the Arbaeen, so there's
yeah,
still only a handful, and
yeah,
some make it into this romantic story. Sure, why not? But I mean, but telling it as such has a particular purpose, and it's important to recognize that, I
yeah,
think, of what it is that one is saying with one's um, study. Um,
yeah,
whether or not one tries to make one kind of a claim, whether or not this is about, oh, look how wonderful the government is involved, or look how wonderful the government is not involved. Either
yeah.
one is a claim, and either one is romantic, and either one is, of course,
Yeah.
overstated. So,
And you also, of course, often have these, these things about politicization. The flying of the Iraqi flag. The anti-Daesh kind of element, which was certainly the case in 2014, 2015.
mhm.
Um, flying of other flags, like I remember the Bahraini flag, especially after 2011, which was part of that as well. Um, and then, of course, you've got other types of studies. I mean, I had an MA student a few years ago, who's now actually a journalist who works on Iraq, who wrote a very interesting dissertation on basically partly the political economy of it, you know. So simple things like, well, how much does it cost? You know, how many people are involved? You know, how many beds are there in Karbala?
Mm,
How is this whole thing sustainable? You know, these
wow.
sorts of questions, and who pays for it, right?
Yes.
So and those kinds of studies I think are extremely useful as well because people have a sense that there's a lot going on, but sometimes if you quantify elements of it, you get a sense of what the actual scale is, you
Mhm.
know. And then of course, when you see that a lot of the money, you know, is it coming from government or is it actually coming from private kind of organizations, you get a sense exactly of the extent of the role of the sorts of non-governmental organizations precisely in, you know, bringing together something which involves millions of people. Um, so yes, I mean that I think that's and you know the whole thing about like on the mokibs on the stands, you know, which mokibs have like kind of cleaner setup, you know, are people wearing gloves, you know, especially nowadays, you know, the kind of
Yeah,
the hygiene element, you know, how hygienic is it, you know, are you worried about you know the obvious things which happen when you're traveling in a hot place, you know, and what you're eating.
absolutely.
So
And that
yeah,
is also an interesting kind of change. It's the kinds of questions that we're concerned with, right? That's a
yeah.
In that case, one could read it as a, shall we say, as a mirror for larger societal issues
Mm.
that one can read back from concerns here.
Yeah.
And that is also
Um,
interesting.
there was just a comment or a question about the gendered elements of this. Maybe we can say something about that. I mean, obviously, in something like Albine, you can see it. It's kind of a weird thing where things are quite separate, but they can't be completely separate, right? So men and women have certain spheres which are distinct, but at the same time, especially between the two shrines, it's very difficult to separate men and women out.
Absolutely. The question is also, I think, what is it that particular studies then want to argue about
Yeah,
the gendered element, right?
yeah,
Oftentimes we want to argue that, oh, look, everybody is like happy and free and whatever else, because that's what we want to say to, of course, an outside audience.
yeah.
By we, I mean in this case, if this is a reporting sort of story. Um, I mean, how do you measure something like that anyways? Are there some going to be unhappily walking along? Does everybody want to walk along, right? Does
Yeah.
somebody, I mean, it's the same. I spent half of my spring semester talking about the French hijab debate. And so this whole question of oppression versus non-oppression, I mean, it is just, I'm not sure even anymore that it is just academically useful anymore to even think
Yeah.
about at that point. I mean, to think about gender as an aspect, sure, like as a perhaps as a descriptive element. I'm not quite sure what the diagnostic
Mm.
element does
Yeah.
for it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there are different kinds of accesses and restrictions. I mean, uh,
Sure.
we know that you know the men's side and the women's side, say in the shrines, even getting in. I mean, it seems to be much more difficult on the women's side. And I mean, those sort of access issues actually much more acute if you look at a place like Saudi Arabia and
Mm.
Medina and
Really?
Prophet's Mosque. And the Prophet's Mosque, of course, men and women have different access to different parts of it
Mm.
at different times. And sometimes women barely have access. It depends on, you know, seasons and things like that. So, I mean,
Mm.
certainly access, equal access is one issue in
Is it
lots of spaces.
is it
Um,
proportional, let me ask you, or is it just disproportional? So like, I mean, if women have fewer, I'm not justifying
You
things
mean
at
by
all.
numbers? So if if the numbers of men are much higher, I mean, I don't think it's that clear cut. I mean, I think
Mm.
there are a lot of women involved as well. But certainly, it's noticeable that issues
Mhm.
around access become
Interesting.
kind of fraught in that way. And I certainly think from my own experience of being in Karbala, it's you sometimes get the impression there's so many more women there,
Mm.
but it is much more difficult to get in. So just because of the sheer numbers. But yeah, I mean, lots of issues, you know. So like, if it's families, who's taking care of the kids? You know,
Sure,
who's making sure people get fed? You know,
sure.
who's taking care of those who are weaker or in wheelchairs? I mean, there's lots of kinds of issues, and
This is true.
uh, I mean, I think you're right. To a certain extent, some of it can come across as being rather descriptive. Um, but I think it's certainly something to think about. It certainly in the other context that we're talking about, you know, how a big center or church, etc., works. One would have thought that gender becomes much more about the power dynamics which are at work um, in organizations like that. So I mean, certainly it's there. It's always there.
Sure. I mean, of course, always it's always also the question of who that particular woman is, right? If you're the
Yeah,
wife of the minister, then it's one thing.
yeah,
Way back when I walked with some important women, and
yeah,
they did not do any of the caring. Just let's put it that way.
yeah.
And it was
And of course, the experience you would have had would be quite different because it would have been quite privileged. So, you know, and
comparatively, yeah,
and, and certainly, I mean, I think that's true with a lot of us, especially if people come from the outside. I think it's very different from, say, like just some poor person who's, you know, walking up from like Nasiriyah or Shatra or somewhere like that, or even Basra. You know. It's a
absolutely.
very different kind of experience. You know, I've often wondered about the implications. Like, I mean, if you're in a job, you're taking what, 10 days, 14 days off? How does that work? What implications does it have for your career? I mean, I really wonder about these sort of very simple questions. And then when they set out, do they think about certain aspects of logistics? You know, how are they going to make it? Do they need any sort of money? Of course, you don't normally need it, but still there's sort of simple material considerations as well.
And then there are lots of other divisions also one could look at, right? So as you said, so we have gender, we have class, then there's of course age, there's passport issues, there are linguistic issues. I mean, there are just so many different issues. Which one does one focus on? And
Yeah,
the one that one focuses on also, I think, betrays one's own interests within
sure.
that study. And that is
Yeah,
always important to just realize.
sure, sure.
Yeah.
So if we return to the kind of the more general, the more universal, um, what do you think these sorts of case studies will tell you about the study of religion? To ask you the really big kind of question, uh, which may well have been something you were asked when you were interviewed for the job as well. But not to put you in that kind of interview mode, but yeah, what do you think this tells us about the study of religion?
Well, the study of religion, let's go one level below that and then think about what it is that, well, what are these examples of, right? So, what
Yeah.
are particular activities? What are the
Okay.
examples of? Are the examples of the obvious one is always something like globalization or global flow of capital,
Mm.
or one could think of it as just in a Foucauldian sense, it's the flow of power that one might think about. One might also think about it in a sort of psychological sense and apply a psychological functionalism here and say
Mm.
that religion here functions as a whatever, like as a reaction to violence, just in generic terms. Um, One could also say that it is simply a whatever social imaginary, using Taylor's
Yeah.
concept, right? So whatever it is that you take this as a sort of symptom of, as an example of, will then guide you towards your particular understanding of what religion is, in a sense,
Yeah.
if it can be defined at all, right? Is it this internal thing? Are we looking for quote unquote spirituality? Are we
Mm.
looking for these social functionary issues? Are we looking at, are we looking at communitas? Are we looking at emancipation? Are we looking
Yeah.
at whatever
So,
rights of
okay, so
whatever?
let,
Hmm.
okay, so let me ask you then, what's your take?
For many years, I've been sort of I was caught up on the whole question of class and education,
Mm.
and now I think over the last couple of years, however, I don't know whether or not I've changed my mind because class and education were, of course, and gender, yes, but have always been questions of access. But now much of that has changed since I would say 2015, perhaps.
Mm.
It seems that with mobility, class is no longer the same as class.
You're right.
Let's just put, if you are a returnee from Germany, let's say you were a refugee there, you might be lower class in Germany, but you're no longer lower class necessarily if you go back. I mean, I'm not saying that you're high class, but I'm
Yeah.
saying that you generally come back with some kind of standing, assuming you've stayed there long enough and did something.
Mm.
So it's so now it's the question, yes, what are the new features that are coming up? That's a good question. I don't know. That's these are things to be thought about in a particular, yeah, in
Yeah.
each context.
I mean, it certainly seems that the study of religion, the more theoretical kind of approaches, are very good at problematizing things. So, it's, the whole question of how do you make religion a fairly elastic concept without it completely becoming sort of unuseful in any analytic way? I think that seems to be a big issue. And then, of course, on the other hand, you've got, you still have, certainly in the study of Islam, you've got plenty of people who, increasingly saying, yeah, but what's wrong with essentialism? Uh, these are features. This is what Islam is. Forget the Shahab Ahmad and others who kind of are taking, of course, things in a slightly different direction. But yeah, no, there's a certain essence, and if you're going to be studying it, these are the sorts of things you need to be looking at. And it's all very well to talk about what people's experiences are, but there are certain normative features, right? So that kind of, what I would perhaps a bit harshly called neo-Orientalist kind of understanding has not, it seems to be gaining some traction in certain contexts. So I really kind of wonder where this is going and where perhaps the equilibrium is going to fall
Mm.
between kind of an over-theorized approach and well, I mean, they're clearly normative features of this.
That's where the next issue sort of, or one of the other my other little pet project at the moment comes
Mm.
in. Well, this is something that some others have also done, like Robert Lange, for instance, did this for Europe by looking at
Mm.
Shiism in Europe, right? But
Yeah.
looking at it sort of in these more broader contexts and also doing a broader comparisons and also again, I keep coming back, of course, to the school of thought I'm now part of, and that is to turn a critical eye towards the academy. And that
Mm.
is basically looking at it in the following sense. So there seems to be a huge difference between Islamic studies in North America versus Islamic studies in Europe. And that
Yeah.
I think has to do, of course, with who does what and in
Yeah.
what context. Let's take Germany, for example. In Germany, until fairly recently, it was a textual approach because, of course, who are you going to be talking to? Are you going to be talking to put this overly crudely, uneducated Turkish migrants from the 60s, right? You're not going to be necessarily talking to those as your quote unquote informants, which is exactly what you do in the United States. In the United States, they really like talking to immigrants as informants.
Mm.
And so there seems to be this very different kind of attitudes of who you're talking to and who you're also responsible to as an academic. In
Mm.
Europe, you're not necessarily responsible to your migrant population as an
Well,
academic.
certainly in Germany, traditionally, no.
But
Although,
changing,
of course,
yeah.
but then, of course, you have this kind of, and neither in Britain for that matter. But of course, in Germany, you've got this very interesting, you know, uh, sort of experiment in Islamic
Yeah.
theology, right?
Yes.
Which is, I mean, certainly I speak to plenty of colleagues in Germany who are still appalled by the idea. But even within the British and other context, I mean, there's a lot of pushback on that, you know. Um, So that seems to be a kind of shift, and because of how much money basically the federal government's pushed in that area, um, you can't ignore it, right? So that's certainly growing, and now I think there's 7 chairs now around the country in Germany,
It was
and
the other day, you're right.
yeah, so it's who knows, and of course there's a whole new center which was established fairly recently in Humboldt, um, which so I mean there seems to be a lot going on there, and it's raising certain tension, and it seems in other cases it's much more to do with supposed disciplinary boundaries. So study of Islam as kind of as it was called, Oriental studies, right? Philology, Oriental philology, or is it study of Islam within the context of history? Or study of Islam within the context of theology, religious studies, and I think those sorts of divisions are very, very clear when you look, particularly in the European context, what's going on, and in the American context, of course, you've had these arguments at places like the AAR between those who would say that it's about method, as opposed to those saying no, it's really about study of understanding what these traditions are in and of themselves.
Well, and also, but also, what is the purpose, right? In particular,
Yeah,
here, it's often people who do well, it are who do Islamic studies are often also involved in interfaith dialogue, and interfaith
yeah,
dialogue is that has a particularly straightforward purpose. It has a particular, even if it is not called a political involvement, that nevertheless it has a particular impetus, and that is, for instance, here something that, of course, we don't do here. And in
yeah,
particular, Russell McCutcheon very much distinguishes, of course, between the academic study of religion in general, not just, of course, Islam, but
mm,
religion in general, as something that is about human beings doing certain things, and what is it that they do, and why, and how, and what does that tell us about larger issues, and
yeah,
rather than trying to quote unquote understand a particular group of people in a particular context.
yeah.
And so it's a
But I
very
mean,
different, yeah, it's
yeah,
interesting.
there's also I think there's a very clear distinction between theology and religious studies as well. I think the problem sometimes in Britain has been that because theology is always usually Anglican, sometimes grudgingly Catholic, um, but never other faiths. Religious studies was the category through which you got other faiths in, right?
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and that doesn't seem to make much sense to me, because it seems that you can certainly approach all sorts of religions from a theological perspective, and
Sure.
but you can also very much approach them from the study of religion as well. um,
As you
and
can from economics,
yeah,
right?
and so certainly the kind of idea that one was for kind of dominant Christian dominations versus the others doesn't really seem to make sense. And certainly I mean I'm very much interested in those who are in the academy trying to do what basically trying to do Muslim theology. I have lots of colleagues who do that, and they
Absolutely.
explicitly would say that. But whether those people, for example, should be in a study of religion department is a different matter,
That,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
but yeah, I mean, I think these cultural distinctions between North American and European academy are quite distinct,
Yeah.
in ways which are quite interesting. But
And then I'd like to sort of broaden this further. I mean, this is
mm,
something that I'm still working on.
yeah,
But yes, it is about a politics of representation, is it not, in that case also?
yeah, of course. And I think there's and power is important as well. I mean, there's always these arguments going on about the study of early Islam and the origins of Islam, and on the one hand, yes, you can say it's a question of method, but on the other hand, it's not just about method. It is actually quite meaningful for a lot of people, and that's where questions of power become important. And if I were to just to piggyback on something which I'm very much interested in the moment, which is decolonization. Um, the study of Islam, desperately needs decolonization, and very much a double movement of decolonization, both in terms of how we've studied it traditionally without taking into consideration any issues around power and positionality, but also not just how the Western Academy studies it, but also how we then buy into certain kind of dominant Muslim narratives about how it is as well. And I think both of those need to be rather dramatically critiqued.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Both the kind of power that certain scholars have these days, well, across the world, and who goes into what, right? The very fact that in the Middle East, Islamic studies is unfortunately oftentimes no longer the top choice, for better or
Yeah,
for worse. And
yeah,
and so therefore, who does the representing in different places in the world is an important question, because that has implications for wider issues of representation. If we only have semi-intellectuals in one parts of the world, and other parts have employ, shall we say, other intellectuals as parts of think tanks or other things, then these things can certainly easily be quote
yeah.
unquote recognized, for lack of a better word. Absolutely, yes, of course.
Cool.
And these things are important to keep in mind. Yes, it's interesting.
Okay. So you mentioned your Syria book's almost done, and so this is I guess this will be the next big book, right? So this will be the project that
Yes,
you're
no.
going to do. Yeah.
I gave it to Simon Mabin at the University of Lancaster. Is now
Oh, okay.
editing a series with Manchester. So I gave it to him
Okay.
because he does desectarianization and
Yeah.
geography, and I thought that that would be interesting. Also, it allows me to talk to perhaps a kind of community that is wider than religious studies. Not to say that at all, as you know, I'm not at all into I don't do political science, and I don't do any of these other things. But nevertheless, I'd like to talk about issues that are a little bit broader than simply whether categorizing rituals of sorts, and doing thick description of certain prayers. Though certainly, of course, that is exactly what I do. But so that is going to be that, and then the next one is going to be about this whole development question. Yeah, we'll think about it, how that is going to be exactly. Perhaps that's going to be partly an expat experience of sorts.
Yeah,
Maybe
no,
it'll.
I think actually bringing in case studies from the US and from Europe will be extremely useful. You know, very much so. And I mean, going forward, with colleagues and friends, we've been talking for such a long time about how, maybe traveling for research is going to be just not an option for the next couple of years or so. We just don't know.
Absolutely.
The idea of just going back out and actually interviewing people, and I don't know when that's going to happen next. I started a project earlier, well, just before Christmas, which was supposed to be mainly in Iraq, and then I quit. And then the day I was supposed to fly into Iraq was unfortunately the day when a couple of rather important people were assassinated. So I don't know when I'm going to be able to go back and do some of those interviews. And so we need to think a bit more creatively about how we're going to do that, our kind of fieldwork.
Absolutely. And in that case, that might help us, or in this case, well, talking about myself, me, but perhaps us all generally more, move towards books that are perhaps have a more central thematic questions, or not even thematic, but larger questions that we can think about, rather than thinking about the particular description of a particular small
Yeah,
thing. So thereby talking to larger issues, and keeping that sort of focus, which might also be helpful pedagogically speaking. We
yeah,
will see, of course.
absolutely.
Yeah. These all
Cool.
moves.
Well, Edith, this has been really interesting, and it's been great to catch up. I think we should call this to a close. Thank you for joining me. Thank you to those who have been following this as well. I will be back tomorrow for the last one of these for this week, when I'll be in conversation with Professor Najam Haider from Barnard College, Columbia University, at 6 o'clock tomorrow, and we'll be talking about the problems of studying early Islamic history. So in many ways, we'll continue the concern with method and how it is that we study religion. But anyway, thank you once again, Edith.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching, and hopefully see you anon. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Take good care. Bye bye.
Yes.
Thanks.